Lauren Steiner from the Robust Opposition, and I've got a very interesting show tonight because it's just going to be me and another independent journalist by the name of Jamarl Thomas, who hosts the Progressive Soapbox. And I actually was a guest on Jamarl's show a few weeks ago, so I'm returning the favor and inviting him to be a guest on my show. How are you doing on this Saturday night, Jamarl?
I am doing fine. Calling me a journalist is way too strong, but I appreciate it. I'll take it.
Yeah, Jimmy Dore said the same thing when I said he was one of the best independent journalists working today. And I guess I should probably be using the word commentator, because unless we're doing real original reporting, we're just commentating. And that's what we're going to do tonight. There are two subjects that seem completely disparate, but they're not, in respect to the fact that the left is being attacked by the left on both of these subjects, and that is Syria, and that is also Black Lives Matter. So just to let you guys know, I sent Jamarl these articles, and we've both been dissecting them, and they're very lengthy and they're very dense, and ultimately, I think we're coming to the conclusion, who knows what the truth is, but you have some founding principles by which, we guide our commentary. And so we're going to get into that. The first one is Syria, of course, because everybody knows that the left has been being attacked by the mainstream media for probably a year now as being Assad apologists. And saying that Assad and Putin and Russia could do no wrong. And they've used this term whataboutism, which is, they accuse us of whataboutism because every time they try to talk about Assad gassing his own people, we say, what about all the things that the United States has done to overthrow governments? And even as recently as Obama extrajudicial drone bombing of innocent civilians. And then they say, whataboutism? Well, I think what's new that we've both noticed is that recently the left, and when I say the left, I don't mean the fake left like MSNBC and CNN, which Fox calls the liberal media. We call it the corporate media. But, trusted independent left-wing media like Democracy Now!, like The Intercept, like Jacobin, the Socialist Magazine, even Sonali Kalhutker, who is with Pacifica Radio, was basically saying, that we are Assad apologists and we cannot excuse what Assad is doing to his own people. So that's what I wanted to talk with Jamarl about. We've talked about it on the phone. Now we're going to talk about it online here. So Jamarl, your initial thoughts.
I agree with you with the whataboutism stuff. I mean, look, either justice is blind or it's not really justice at all. It's somebody's making a determination that one person, they want to do something with one person, but they want to give a pass to someone else. I think my issue with the Syria thing, that what these people calling apologists, they don't know. Like it's two things. I understand that they can take this disposition of, look, you can say that Assad has done really ghastly and horrible things. You don't have to say he's a beautiful, don't have to hug Assad. While at the same token say, not necessarily saying you want to have strikes. Like, this is one of those things that Glenn Greenwald said, where he's like, well, he ceded ground on this point of Assad being a bad guy, while at the same token is saying, well, the strikes would be illegal. You don't have to hug Assad on this. What Assad is somewhat irrelevant to the conversation to me. It becomes down to, did he do it? Make them prove their case. The reason why I say make them do it is because I don't necessarily think people have this clarity of saying, yes, he did it, but by the same token, we shouldn't do strikes. I think we've been so conditioned to this idea of something bad takes place. Now there needs to be some kind of action, some kind of muscular action for this bad thing that's taking place. Well, I don't want to see ground on that if I don't have to. Like, yes, if necessary, if the OPCW goes and says, yes, Assad has done this, then fair enough. That's the world that we're in. That's the conversation that we have. And we make this case of it is grossly illegal for the United States or any of these countries to go and attack another country in this way. And yes, also, what about these other countries that are also doing bad things, such as Israel murdering people outright, Obama literally destroying Libya where they're selling slaves, Saudi Arabia walking around as if this, the playboy selling himself all throughout the countries, as if he's perfectly okay. The guy's a butcher, he's a killer, he's selling terrorism out throughout the world. So yes, they might want to say whataboutism. They call it whataboutism because they don't want to deal with the honest conversation of what we're saying is true. It's like, yes, Assad is doing bad things. Assad is a horrible, horrible guy. But what does that have to do with us and whether or not he's done this particular thing? He can be a horrible, horrible guy, but not necessarily have gassed his people in this particular occasion. And that's what it boils down to. Did he do it?
Well, the Intercept article by Mehdi Hassan deals with that. And he says, okay, even if we concede that he didn't gas his people last week, a year ago, and in 2013, let's talk about the barrel bombs, and then he has a link. Let's talk about the cluster bombs, and then he has a link. Let's talk about
the bad guy.
And
he's a bad guy.
About the people who are detained in jails. Something like 6,787 people have died in detention camps. And I'm reading this stuff, and as I feel like in today's world, there's a lot of people that don't do their original research. They tend to believe people they watch, people they trust. And if the people they watch and trust have a similar outlook on the world as they do, they take whatever they say as true.
As benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, and I know some people have said that to me, like, oh, you curate my news for me, Lauren. And I'm like, oh my God, what a responsibility. I have the sources that I read and I like, and I'm passing them on. And I also have my own opinion. But what started to get to me, and I have to be really honest with you, is that literally I was patting myself on the back for having an opinion on this as early as October of 2017, even before Trump won the election. I was asked to moderate a panel of a film called Shadow World, which is about the weapons manufacturers and the international arms dealers. And I did a lot of research into why, we support these wars, why we have a permanent war economy. And it's basically because of that, not because we're trying to spread democracy around the world.
Right.
And I'm pretty convicted in this belief, and I know you are as well. But, I felt like I needed to have some sources to justify what I was saying. And with Syria, I was relying almost exclusively on, Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett. And these were journalists who actually reported from Aleppo, unlike some of the mainstream media reporters that are headquartered in Beirut.
Yeah, never been there.
And so, yet, what do we know about Vanessa Beeley? What do we know about Eva Bartlett? What is their orientation? It seems like everybody has to have a bias. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfectly objective journalist, just like there's no such thing as a perfectly objective person.
Correct.
So now it's like I'm questioning everything.
Well, you should. I mean, but see, I don't look at this from the standpoint of perfect truth. I don't assume truth. I don't assume that I'm going to know. I've never been to Syria. Like there are certain sources that I look at, and it's like, okay, do I trust this person a little bit more than the other person, et cetera. But there is no such thing as objectivity. We're all perspectives floating in a void to some degree. There is no such thing as this is the bare bones reality of what is taking place. Ultimately, I look at this and say, what is the response that the United States or these other nations want to take? Assume that what they say is correct. What is the response? And the response usually boils down to, we need to punch someone in the nose, which means you're going to kill civilians.
Yeah.
Like that's my bearing on this. It's one thing if they could say, look, we can end this situation without killing any civilians and we can make this. They can't say that. In fact is, the moment that you end up having a conversation on this and you say, we've been paying terrorists in that part of the world. It's like, what? What do you mean we've been paying terrorists in that part of the world? Like, that's a stunning thing. Like, it should be a startling thing to hear that your government has literally been giving money and resources to terrorists that have been raping, pillaging, and killing in that part of the world. Now, Assad is a bad guy, but Assad is a bad guy dealing with people who've been doing bad things in his country. Like, it's so murky and it's so gross. So has the terrorists released chemical weapons? Probably. Has Assad released chemical weapons? Probably. They're both probably guilty. Like, that's where I end up on.
Well, I think the thing about proving it, because you said initially, let's let those observers go over there and find what they find. Absolutely. I mean, there are such thing as objective facts. Maybe there's not objective people, but there are objective facts. And this is what I was trying to comb through by going through the Intercept article and the links. And, you know, you come up with Human Rights Watch. And this Reuters article, Human Rights Watch found that they were doing these cluster bombs, and then there was, that was the barrel bombs. The barrel bombs, The Reuters cited Human Rights Watch, who did the barrel bombs, but the New York Times cited the cluster bombs. And actually, they had 2 New York Times reporters that were on the ground and showed photos of the shells that they saw. So these were firsthand accounts by reporters who were right there where the bombs were dropped, and they showed photos. Now, I know that the New York Times was the one that spread the lies about weapons of mass destruction, but those lies were just reporting on what the deep state, the permanent government was saying. This is actually 2 reporters on the ground looking at the shells, and there was something in that article that said, yes, there was one rebel house that was shelled, but there was a lot of civilian casualties. Yes. So what I got out of that was 2 things. First thing was, civilian casualties. There's always civilian casualties in war on both sides. And what about, what we did, here's the whataboutism again, but what about Obama's drone strikes, okay? He was trying to, there were no civilians being killed because they changed the definition. Yes. 18-year-old male that was 16. 16?
It was 16. It was 16.
16-year-old male that was in the vicinity of a suspected terrorist, not even a known terrorist, was classified as a military combatant.
Amazing, right?
Yeah, and that's how they got around reducing the number of civilians that were killed.
They killed thousands. Like literally thousands. Some of those strikes were like 90% of the people killed were civilians. Like it was over the top gross in what Obama was doing. But Obama wears a suit and he sings very well. So he would get out there, he would croon and everything else. And people were like, oh my God, he's Obama, he's awesome. And they would give a blind eye to all of these people. My biggest issue with a lot of stuff that takes place from the media standpoint is that they make this assumption that whatever the United States does is right. Doesn't matter what it is. We may screw up, but they assume that what we're going to do is right. So they give a pass. They don't say certain things. So they don't bring up Libya. Or at the very least, they didn't bring up Libya for God knows how long. They don't bring up Yemen. That doesn't come up in conversation. They don't bring up what Saudi Arabia is doing. They don't bring up any of this stuff. And then all of a sudden, look at what they're doing in Syria. Oh my God. It puts me in, my wife and I were in Iceland. I think it was Iceland. And we were walking back. I forget where we were. We were in Reykjavik, but we were walking back. And a goose, I think it was a swan. And I know it sounds weird, a bunch of wood to chop, but it makes my point. There was a swan that was kind of just floating around. It was like, oh, look at these beautiful birds and everything else. The swan jumps up, grabs a baby duck, literally grabs it in his mouth and flies away, kills it, eats it. Everybody there is horrified. All of these people of all these different nationalities, like just this utter shock. My wife is looking at this and be like, oh my God, I hate swans. She hates swans at this point. People are trying to like hit the swan and everything else. And then my wife, we go and she goes to a burger joint and she has a hamburger with no issue of irony or anything else. And missing the point that the swan is using the tools at its disposal. It doesn't have a chef to go and make this thing beautiful and manufacture it and everything else. It just eats the bird because that's the way it has to do. That's its nature. Whereas the chef has had somebody to pay for this thing to be cooked a particular way, to look a particular way, and serviced in a particular way. Assad is not any different than any other person. Assad is in that country. He's an autocrat. And he just so happened that these are the tools at his disposal. Any other person, if Obama was in Syria right now at this very moment, he would be using the exact same tools that Assad is using. Some of this stuff becomes somewhat systemic. This is not me giving Assad a pass for his horribleness in the things that he's doing. But it is kind of acknowledging that he's an autocrat holding power in this country. And the United States turns a blind eye in some cases, and the United States doesn't turn a blind eye in other cases. This is one of those cases where they don't turn a blind eye because they want him out of that seat. Well, and let's be honest, just one last point.
Okay.
That war would have been over with by now if Western powers weren't putting munitions and money and sources to terrorist groups.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the ridiculousness of how much they were wringing their hands about, oh my God, how bad this war is. Thousands and thousands of people have died. Missing the point of, hey, if you didn't pay resources to these terrorists and give these money and weapons to these people, that this war would have been far over with long by now. They wanted Bashar al-Assad out of that seat. And they were willing to deal with a certain amount of civilians and horribleness and everything if that could accomplish that goal.
Well, they've been wanting to get rid of the government since the 1950s.
Yeah.
And in the 1970s, when Assad's father took over. And, you know, I was thinking when you were talking about this, I was thinking about our civil war, because really what's going on there is a civil war. He's trying to retain territory.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously when you're having a war in your own country, like if we were engaging in the Civil War again and we were fighting, and we, the North, let's just call the North the liberals and the South the racist reactionaries, just for argument's sake. And we, the North, were trying to take the South and win the war. I mean, obviously there would be civilian casualties. Obviously the soldiers would be hiding in the houses and in the hospitals and in the schools with the civilians. I mean, this is what they say about Hamas. This is what Israel says about Hamas. They're hanging out in all these places. Well, where are they supposed to hang out? I mean,
yeah. What are they going to say? And beyond that, it just to add one more point. Imagine for the moment that the Russians were supporting the South, and the Russians in media and whatever else at the time, they said, this is the free rebels of the United States. And these free rebels of the United States are fighting for freedom and justice in that country against that the regime of Lincoln. Like, imagine that, like the weirdness of that statement, the races and everything else. Essentially, you have a band of terrorists who are trying to take over the United States government. That's what it literally boils down to.
Yeah.
Like, we're doing that in that country, essentially supporting the terrorist elements who wants to put in this kind of Islamic law in that country. And the United States are saying that these guys are moderates. This is the same thing. Like, hey, if you're 16 years and older, you're all of a sudden a civilian, not a civilian, you're a terrorist. Well, in this case, if you're on the side of the United States, you're a moderate. Like, it's amazing. Like, it's somewhat Orwellian in the way that the language is being shaped and changed in order to get across an impression to the public.
Well, before 2014, when we entered the war, we called the Al-Nusra Front terrorists.
Yes, right.
Because it's clear, and it is clear, that they are an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So that's why Obama, to his credit, up until that point, did not get into the war. So the first instance of him gassing his own people was in 2013. And I forget who disproved that one being a false flag. But anyway, like you said, they were going to win the war. They were basically fighting ISIS. And Russia was helping them fight ISIS. And we're supposed to want to get rid of ISIS. I mean, but we created ISIS because there was no ISIS until we invaded Iraq.
Yeah.
So that had to do with the de-Baathification policy that was so stupid after the last president said mission accomplished. And then they sent in Paul Bremer, and they got rid of every single Ba'athist party member of the government. They were Sunnis, and they put in Shiites, leaving a vacuum. And what did these Sunni, who are secularists, by the way, the Ba'athists were secularists. Saddam's government, just like Assad's government, is secularist. They recruited fundamentalists to be their army, so to speak. And so they used this fundamentalism as a cynical ploy, if you will, to have fighters to try to take the country back.
That's amazing. And even the oddity of us in the United States talking about whether or not Assad is a horrible guy. George Bush killed 1 million people in that country. And, you know, they call it weapons of mass destruction. There have been no sanctions. There have been nothing. I mean, he's out there painting right now. They're doing tours on like Ellen or somebody. And we're talking about Assad. Even at the worst count, Assad, in that war, several hundred thousands of people died. Like, it's just weird to me. Like, it feels like the world has no legitimacy in this. I meaning the world powers, the Western powers. You know, oh my God, they're using sarin gas or they're using some kind of chemical gas. But we're going to completely turn a blind eye to the fact that 1 million people died in that country. And that the reason why we're fighting quote unquote ISIS now is because of the way we smashed that country to bits. It goes beyond that. Even Europe, the falling apart of Europe, all of this, like Le Pen and all these other people, even you can make a case for Brexit, has to do with the Syrian refugees flooding into that country. Well, why are they flooding into the country? We smashed that country to bits, and I guess my point is, we're talking about all of this stuff being contextualized into a very specific point of Assad. And the conversation needs to be had in a wider way of why is that war taking place in the first place? That completely ignored it.
Well, they're now talking about a humanitarian war. And if you remember, that was the justification that Clinton used to go into Bosnia and Yugoslavia and all those countries. Yeah. And I wasn't paying a lot of attention during the Clinton years. I call it my yuppie stage. I had gotten married. I was having my kids. I had my house that I was remodeling, doing all that sort of stuff and not really paying attention to politics, except for NAFTA. I think you and I talked, and I found myself oddly agreeing with Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot about NAFTA, because they were right. The giant sucking sound that took over 5 million high-paying factory jobs for people without a college education out of our country. And to me, that was really the start of the movement that led to Brexit and led to Trump, because it was the inequality, the increasing wealth and income inequality, and the fact that the middle class is being squeezed, to use Elizabeth Warren's language, that there hardly is a middle class anymore. Everybody's poor. There's that statistic that 49% of Americans don't have $400 in the bank to pay for an emergency. Yeah. And 49% of Americans are one accident, job loss, and illness away from dire poverty. Yeah. And got 20% of Cal State students sleeping in their cars. They're homeless. I mean, we're becoming almost like a third world country. And this, to me, is the cause of Brexit and the rise of Trump, is the increasing wealth and inequality. But they're blaming, the right wing is blaming the other, the immigrant, the illegal, whatever they want to call it. And as opposed to the real cause, which are, the corporations, the billionaires and the millionaires taking all the wealth, extracting all the wealth from the country for their own, greed.
They would never name that. The right wing would never name it, and Democratic Party would never name that. Like, do you remember Klobuchar? The guy came on MSNBC, and plutocrat, billionaire Klobuchar said he called Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and told them to shut up about class. Like, think about that. Like, he's coming on network television. This is not a billionaire in the shadows dictating what these people are doing. This is the guy literally brazen enough to come on network television saying, I heard Nancy Pelosi, and I called Nancy Pelosi, and I called Chuck Schumer. There was one other person he called. And he said, I told them to shut up about this class stuff. It's anti-aspirational. And I told them I would shut my wallet if they brought up this thing of class again. Outright saying, I am paying you, and I will take away the money from you if you talk about issues of class. That is mind-blowing. Yeah. And same thing on the Republican side. One of the Republicans came out, said, if we don't pass this tax plan, they said, lose our phone number. These are plutocrats saying that we are buying your politicians openly. And the fact is, Republicans are just lock, stock, and completely bought. Democrats are not going to use this issue of class. What they're going to do is say these guys are racist. Just look at what they're saying, playing off the idea of these people having this kind of reaction to what's taking place with this neoliberals thing.
Yeah.
You have a party, and the flat truth. You have a party, Democratic Party, that has two camps. This kind of lefty camp, and you have this right-wing camp that's part of the Democratic Party that's kind of suckled itself in using Bill Clinton as kind of the shoehorn to get into the party itself. And you have these guys saying we're moderates. And what that just means is we're going to talk in a particular piece of language that caters to the left, while at the same token taking policies that go to the right. Do you know Joe Manchin voted like 60% with Trump? He just made a video talking about how he's in solidarity with West Virginians. The man is a plutocrat. He's like millionaire. And yet it's the language that he's going to use to try to code himself in, while at the same token representing the interests of the people who are paying them. And when I say paying, I mean literally the money that these guys need to get into office. They look at this as their vital life sign. And between representing lefties and taking that money, they're going to take the money. It's the way it is, the way politics is run at this point. So
Well, they're using identity politics for sure. Yeah. Both sides are using identity politics. And this is another thing that before we talk about the Black Lives Matter aspect of this discussion, is an issue that I've fought with leftists online about a lot. Mm-hmm. Because I feel like Bernie Sanders had it right, We can all identify as part of the 99%.
Yes, agree.
Then we don't get into what is called the oppression Olympics, where each identity feels like that they are the most oppressed and their issue has to be addressed before we can even have a further conversation. Like, African Americans you may talk to will say the original sin is slavery and we must have reparations. Feminists will say the original sin is patriarchy and we must overcome the, patriarchy, or, whatever is said. Native Americans also talk about the genocide. And these are all real things. These are all legitimate things. But are they a reason to divide us and go back into our own little silos, which, the other issue groups do too? Forget about the identity issue groups. You have the environmental groups. You have the anti-war groups. You have the immigration groups. You have let's think of some other causes on the left. And then when you have the nonprofit industrial complex, as I call them, the foundations that start to give money to nonprofits, and then they start telling me, like my favorite one is Food and Water Watch, because they're the most radical of all the NGOs, and they tell me, oh, they can't do this because their grant only covers them to work on this. And then you start to see who's calling the shots.
Yeah.
So I'm very skeptical. Back to Syria. They talk about Human Rights Watch. So I'm thinking,
who's that guy? Yeah, who is he? Right.
No, not the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. That's the one who they cited. The New York Times cited in the Shelling Civilians article. That's one guy in the U.S. who's anti-Assad. But the Human Rights Watch, which is a very famous group like Amnesty International that everybody thinks is beyond reproach, well, apparently they've been politicized, because the first thing I found when I Googled them is they were saying things about something that happened in some Arab country that was coming out of the mouths of a pro-Al-Qaeda group. So then I'm putting together, I'm saying, oh, Al-Qaeda, who else is with Al-Qaeda? The Al-Nusra Front, which is a group that the U.S. is supporting. So it's like, I'm going to have Corey Morningstar on my show, because she writes a blog called The Wrong Side of Green, in which she dissects all these nonprofits and who they take money from. And you probably remember Max Blumenthal's article about the white helmets.
Yes.
In which he found that it was a group called the Syria Campaign, which is allied with Avaz. Now, how many petitions have we signed that have the name of Avaz on there? A-V-A-A-Z. Well, it turns out that during the Libyan crisis, they had on their website, we should establish a no-fly zone in Libya.
Wow! No way! No way!
And in Syria, they said we should have a no-fly zone in Syria. And you know who else wanted a no-fly zone in Syria? Hillary Clinton. And everybody was saying that's a sure way to get into a war with Russia. So, you've got this group of Oz supporting the Syria campaign. And where's the money coming from? A guy by the name of Ayman Asfari, who turns out to be a British industrialist, and his company is called Petrofrac. And what do they want? Why do they start this thing? Because they want this pipeline going through Syria that Assad doesn't want in there. So obviously this guy Petrofrac has an incentive, and so they start the white helmets, and we fund the white helmets, even though there was already a humanitarian group that was recognized by the UN for 50 years. All of a sudden, we're not talking about them. We're talking about the white helmets, which is brand new. And then, of course, we have, other sources showing that the white helmets are in league with the Al-Nusra Front. I mean, just recently, that woman, Carla, who am I thinking of?
I know you're talking about. Yeah, I know you're talking about the one for the UN.
She's the Bolivian actress, and I just put something on my Facebook.
Oh, I know you're talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about.
At the White Helmets headquarters, which was conveniently located right next door to the Al Nusra Front headquarters.
I saw that. Yeah.
You know, it's like, I don't know, even our own groups who we love to cite, I'm suspicious of them because of, you know, where they get their funding.
My disposition on this is to not see ground on anything until they demonstrate what they're saying. Like, because I just honestly don't believe that the public itself is going to be able to create the distinction between something bad took place and now something needs to take place to remedy the thing that's bad that's taking place. Nor do they have the context from the Western media to acknowledge, okay, this is a bad thing that's happening in the world, but this is also a bad thing that's happening in the world, and this is also a bad thing that's happening in the world. They don't get that context. Like, I've sat there, I had to watch CNN, I think, yesterday, and as you're watching it, you're like, this is mind-numbing. Like, this is absolutely mind-numbing. If this is the perspective, and to give a complete emblematic of it, and I use this all the time, Jake Tapper talking to Tulsi Gabbard after she comes back from Syria, where she goes to Syria, she's doing the job that CNN is not doing, and she comes back and she tells Jake Tapper's hitting her in the knees in this interview, by the way, and it's almost as if he's hitting her in the knees in an interview, and she says, Jake, we're paying terrorists to undermine their government, and the people in Syria want us to stop, and they just want the United States to stop, and they don't understand why we're doing this when we weren't the ones that attacked them on 9/11. Now, this is mind-blowing. Like, this is like the idea that a reporter hears this, and Jake Tapper's response is to repeat the government's line as a stenographer, and instead of just being aghast and horrified by what he's just been told by this. They suck at their job, or at the very least, they're doing a particular job that they're not telling the American public. And it is not a good one with regards to context of wider events and historical significance. Yeah. So I don't want to see ground on that issue of whether or not they did it unless they can prove that they did it.
Well,
that's my disposition. Because, one last point, part of the reason I don't want to see ground is because I don't want to see what comes next. Like what comes next is we have our justification. Now we're going to punch somebody in the nose. They're going to skip that hurdle of whether or not we should punch somebody in the nose. They're going to completely bypass it. And it is going to be killing of civilians and invading a country. And oftentimes for reasons not being stated.
Well, I think we just need to go back to the principle that unless a country has directly
company is right.
Yeah, we have no business, being over there. I'm by nature a non-interventionist, and this was the one thing about Trump and Steve Bannon. Yes, I'll say his name. That appealed to me, and I did hear Trump say that we should not have been in Iraq. And I did know that when he campaigned, he wanted to get us out of Afghanistan. And isn't it coincidental that as soon as he tweeted that we were getting out of Syria, all of a sudden you have this latest attack, and then he gets goaded into bombing them again because he's so reactionary. I mean, he's got no impulse control. He just has a thought and he says it or he does it, and everything is related to how he is perceived, of course, because he's such a narcissist and he sees that's how he sees the world. So however, somebody did do a tweet in which they analyzed the words in that tweet, the one where he talked about gas killing. He called Assad a gas killing animal.
Call him an animal, right? Call him an animal.
This person who analyzed the tweet, had picked out a lot of words that said Trump has never used these words in a tweet before. So I'm thinking, maybe they've gotten a hold of his Twitter account because of this whole thing with Mueller. Mueller, we all knew that they weren't going to find any collusion with Russia to hack the election. But I knew all along that they were going to find out about his dirty business practices. And that's what they found out. That's what they're threatening him with. And that's why I think he's playing along with the deep state and their wars. And that's why he said we're going back into the TPP, which was the second only good thing I liked about him, was that he got us out of the TPP. He said he was going to, and he did. So
I could not disagree with you more. I could not disagree with you more. And the reason, and just for a very specific reason, I know that sometimes, like when Obama was in office, do you remember when he first took office? Everybody was hopeful and wishful, and they were like, Obama's playing 3-dimensional chess. Obama's playing 10-dimensional chess. Obama is going to take the chains off in that first year, and you find out, oh, he's just a Republican. He's just a moderate Republican. I think Donald Trump has put in Bannon. I mean, not Bannon, Bolton. And I think that gets across what his policies are going to be. I think somebody comes to him. I think any random person who takes that job, who's not necessarily familiar with that job, and somebody comes in and with a bunch of things on their collar, and they say, look, Mr. President, we need you to sign this. We need to bomb them immediately. Otherwise, Americans are going to die. If somebody else calls him and says, look, Mr. President, this needs to take place right now. Americans are going to die. We need to maintain our geopolitical thing. You're going to fail on your campaign promise of America first, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, Donald Trump signs it. I don't think he has. It's like that. Have you ever listened to those tapes with Jackie Kennedy, John Kennedy talking to during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they're having a conversation back and forth about how they're going to prevent Russia or Soviet Union from gaining in ground and all this other stuff. And John Kennedy had the balls to tell the military no. Like the military wanted to do first strikes. They wanted to literally strike Cuba, in which case immediately, if they would have struck Cuba, the order, Khrushchev had already given the order that, yes, you attack the United States if they attack Cuba because those missiles were already active. John F. Kennedy had the balls to tell the military no. I don't necessarily think Trump does.
Well, you know what? Let me tell you something. I haven't gotten up to this chapter yet, but I'm reading about that very thing now in Cy Hirsch, speaking of
Camelot.
His book called The Dark Side of Camelot. And they overblew, if that's the verb for overblown, they totally over-exaggerated the Cuban Missile Crisis threat. And I would love for you...
What? You think so? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Tell me.
I haven't that chapter yet, but the point is, none of us know what's going on. You know, Trump is being excoriated right now for having these back-channel communications with Russia. Well, guess who else had back-channel communications with Russia? Bobby Kennedy, the whole time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and even before, was talking to some Russian agent, smoothing things over, working things out, allowing Khrushchev and John Kennedy, to be as bellicose as they want so that they could get the support of their people, whereas in the back channels, they were working out a plan, and nothing is as it seems. You know, the other thing that went on was he had hookers going in and out of the White House every single day. I mean, every single day that Jackie was not in that White House. And when he was on the road, they were procuring hookers for him. And, you know, also, the third thing is that he worked with the mafia. I mean, the mafia got him elected in 1960, the mafia and the Teamsters. And these three things that Jack Kennedy did, our liberal darling, John F. Kennedy Jr., John F. Kennedy, are exactly the same things that we excoriate Trump over. Now, I'm not a fan of these things, whether it's Kennedy doing it or Trump doing it. But let's, talk about whataboutism. Let's be real here.
I agree with you and I disagree with you. So the part I agree with you on is that they did have a back channel, yes, but it was dangerous. Like I don't think it was as lighthearted or as this was dangerous. Like there's a phone call between John F. Kennedy and Eisenhower, where John F. Kennedy is asking him whether Khrushchev is being serious about this because they are on this level of brinksmanship. And you're right, they're being bellicose, but they are talking in back channels to one another, trying to smooth it out. But they didn't know they were able to smooth it out. Khrushchev sent this panicked letter to communication to the White House, and they said either the guy was drunk or under severe stress, realizing, oh my God, we've stepped over a brink. How can we bring this back? They had hardliners in Russia or in the Soviet Union that were ready to go over the edge. In the same way that they had hardliners in the United States who were ready to go over the edge. Those military soldiers were like, we can take out the entirety of Russia. They may destroy our East Coast. Like, this is where they were. There was one of the conversation between Eisenhower and Kennedy. Eisenhower told him Khrushchev is bluffing. And don't worry, Khrushchev is bluffing. Eisenhower was wrong. Khrushchev was not bluffing. Khrushchev had in his notes, if the United States attack. Because I would argue Khrushchev didn't have a choice. The hardliners at that point would have won. Khrushchev in no way could have backtracked at that point. The moment that the United States struck anything in Cuba, he was forced through mechanical means to attack. Like, that would have been the end of the world. I feel you, they can be bellicose, and they were talking behind the scenes, but I think that was far more worrying and terrifying. And I think this is just as terrifying because you don't have, for all of Kennedy's faults, I think he had a certain amount of savvy about him. I don't necessarily know that's true for Trump, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I think Trump, when he came in, he was trying to bring, pull us from the brink. I don't want to deal with this. I don't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not now. Like, not now. I just feel like this is different. John Bolton being behind Donald Trump freaks me out.
Yeah, John Bolton is the worst of the worst. I mean, George Bush didn't want him in his administration.
Do you know he's still now talking about a nuclear thing, saying that there's a weapons of mass destruction now between North Korea, Iran, and somewhere else? Like, this is the stuff he's saying. He was on, what is that right winger's name? Tucker Carlson. He was talking to Tucker Carlson and was making this argument for another weapons of mass destruction triad. And Tucker Carlson ate him alive, like completely ate him alive. But he was still pushing this nonsense. And the idea that this maniac is in Donald Trump's ears, terrifying.
Well, before we go to the Black Lives Matter thing, which I really do want to discuss, what do you think of this thing with North Korea? Because yesterday I heard on the radio that Kim
Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un.
It's like, what's one of them?
Said that they were going to stop their nuclear, interballistic missiles and mid-range missiles testing. And this came as a result of a summit with the president of South Korea. And back-channel communications.
With Mike Pompeo, yeah.
So I said, you watch for the mainstream media. Minimize this, dismiss it, say it's
going to boo-hoo it. She's going to like, oh, this is horrible. This is a horrible thing.
Credit. And I'm not speaking about Trump's motives, because I think Trump's motives are not good. I don't think he gives a shit about the country. I don't think he gives a shit about the American people. I don't think he
care about his motives. No, if he mails us, I don't care about his motives.
It's all about his own, image and his own business and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not saying anything good about Trump's motives, but he can't do anything, even by accident, that it is good and get any credit from this mainstream media. Would you agree with that one?
I would absolutely agree with that. Do you know when Rachel Maddow, when Trump first said he'd meet with Kim Jong-un, Rachel Maddow was like, oh, this is horrible. No president would ever do this. And then I rolled back to the clip with Obama saying I would meet with the president of North Korea or the leader of North Korea. She didn't poo-poo it then. She had no issue with it then. Like this is nonsense. It's if the president of the United States, by hook or by crook, is able to get some level of peace, they've been at war for like 50, 60 years. And they're literally talking about reconciling with North and South Korea. Like that, this is amazing news. Like imagining all those American troops able to come home because those two nations finally reconcile. That's amazing news. And yeah, they're going to completely minimize it. They're going to poo-poo it. They're going to say, oh, this is horrible. But no, I don't care what Donald Trump's motives is on this. If he gets it, if it actually works. Now, that being said, Kim Jong-un would be crazy to give up his nuclear weapons. He would be insane to give up his nuclear weapons. Why would he? And understand what I mean by this. North Korea, their ace in the hole that the United States doesn't attack is this capacity to destroy Japan and South Korea. If they give that capacity up, they can be attacked. Now, in the same way that Libya could be attacked, in the same way that Iraq could be attacked, in the same way that Syria can be attacked, they can be attacked. In fact, is the one thing that's stopping the United States from smashing that country to bits is their capacity to destroy South Korea and destroy Japan, both of our interests. I think it would be weird for them to give up nuclear weapons, speaking from the perspective of North Korea. That being said, if they can have some reconciliation, that's great. From the perspective of the United States, them giving up their nuclear weapons is great.
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't advise it.
I wouldn't advise it either. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea.
Olivia, I wouldn't advise it, but you know what? Go for it, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to segue into this Black Lives Matter thing, and I'm going to try to do this screen sharing thing.
Okay.
But I don't know if that's going to work because right now I have Google Hangouts as a separate window, and I don't even have the thing that says screen sharing. So maybe I'll just read.
Go for it. Hit the screen share thing and then try to hit it one more time.
I'm not even
everybody.
No idea. I'm not even seeing the screen sharing thing because it's the separate window. But this article that was just published by John Ginger, who is an African-American person, I just want to make that very clear. Okay. An article in the Mint Press News that was published on the 17th that says, "Speaking Fees Selfie, Sucking Up to Power, How Black Lives Matter Lost Its Mojo." I thought that was a great title. And then the subtitle is, "The Black Panther Party Remains Beloved in the African American Community 52 years after its founding, revered for its nutrition and health programs, fearless defense of the people, and self-sacrifice. The BLM leadership, on the other hand, poses for fashion magazine photo spreads." So, you know, ouch.
That's brutal.
That's really ouch. And there's a great picture. If I could show, you know, it's Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and Patrice Cullors all dialed up at some Glamour magazine awards. So the article basically, and this is now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is this is the second time I've read an article critical of Black Lives Matter. Yeah. This article was written on the news peg that the Cincinnati chapter withdrew from the larger coalition, and they joined the New York chapter, which had already done the same thing. And they were saying that they really weren't providing the resources and the support to the local chapters and the efforts that they were doing. And they were inadvertently sabotaging or taking away money from or taking away attention from the efforts that they had already started in those communities. Yeah. And then the other article that was cited in there was something that I hadn't read, but I had read about, and that was Bruce Dixon's critique in the Black Agenda report about how they were pressing Black, well, two things. One, they were taking money from the Ford Foundation and George Soros. And two, they were starting a credit card with a company, with a bank called One World Bank, which is a Black-owned bank. And they quoted Melina Abdullah, who I know personally. She's an organizer for Black Lives Matter here in LA, saying what a great deal this was. There was going to be a young Black child's face on there, and this would, you know, give them pride in Black banks and Black institutions, and let's spend our money in Black places. And then, of course, you know, this article by Benjamin Dixon talks about what a myth that is, Black capitalism, because he's coming from a socialistic.
Yeah, he's socialist, right?
Yeah. And, you know, the World Socialist website also had an article critical of Black Lives Matter for these two things. But their point of view was that, and I disagree with them on this, they were saying all lives matter and that Black Lives Matter was distracting from the larger class orientation that we should be having.
Oh, I see. They're attacking on identity basis as opposed to, I understand.
And I think we can have both. And I think Bernie Sanders in his campaign had come to learn that we can have both. We can say that even if we had total income equality, total education equality, people were still going to be pulled over for driving while Black.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So what do you think of those articles?
So I didn't get the chance to read all of the articles because I started reading the Syria article. I started diving more so in the details of it. I did read the basics or the beginnings of each one of the articles. So let me say that first. So if I say anything that runs counter to the article, I want to make it clear that I haven't read each and every part of it. What I would say is this. You need both. Like I've often said on my show that whites don't regard their history honestly. And I tend to push this narrative or push this thing of class matters more because it does, because class hits everything. Class is not just one of those, it's not a pocket of sorts. Class is like 99% of the population. And so it pulls everyone in the sandbox. But I think you need both. You have to have both. I don't think you can get away without both. I mean, it's like you look at the disparity within wealth between African Americans, whites, and so forth. It's gigantuan. Like the amount of money that African Americans lost under Obama was tremendous. Part of it was because so much of that wealth was held in their houses because, you know, we didn't have our wealth in some other particular way. It was in our houses. So the moment that those houses went belly up, well, that wealth went out the window. So I do think there needs to be a recognition, though, like even from the standpoint of institutions. So an African American gets pulled over 4 times more likely to go to jail. If you have this thing of the number of people who are sitting in jail now, the overwhelming majority have done for drugs. Well, those people aren't necessarily in jail for good per se. They're just in jail waiting because they couldn't afford to pay bail. Like there are certain racial divides that are set up in this country just based on the way this country was. It has to be regarded honestly. If that somewhat boils down to this thing of let me skip that part. I think a lot of this boils down to class, but I think it has to be addressed both. I don't think you can ignore one for the other. I think you need both. Martin Luther King was virulently anti-racist, but he was also a socialist. Like, both of those things melded perfectly well. I think you do have to protect certain identities. The DACA thing, I think, is a big deal. That's not necessarily purely a class thing. Part of it does boil down to class, but part of it also boils down to these people are immigrants in this country and they need to be protected as such. You should not have a situation where you're putting somebody in prison for smoking a plant. Like just full stop. And the fact that 4 times African Americans are 4 times more likely to get put in prison for doing the exact same thing goes beyond this thing of class. Like I understand that they're critiquing their argument of this idea of black capitalism, where you're going to have a small percentage get fabulously wealthy. Well, this is not necessarily going to be also for the rest of the population. This is for a small percentage. Let's keep it real. Now, but I also understand the perspective of Black Lives Matter, of this idea of wanting, you're in a capitalistic system, acknowledging you're in a capitalistic system and trying to get some level of ends in that system. The problem is, and it's always the case, that you've had this association between blacks and the Democratic Party. And I don't think people are crazy for asking, is this one of those shoehorns into that particular mode? But I don't know if that's true. I don't know enough about Black Lives Matter to kind of criticize.
Well, let me ask you just about this question about black capitalism, because I'm reading from Bruce Dixon's article in which he quotes a guy by the name of Dr. Jared Ball, who works at Morgan State University. And he wrote a treatise called The Myth of Black Buying Power.
Yeah.
And he says, he reveals that phrase originated as, quote, the sales slogan of black marketers a generation ago who wanted to convince clients they had a lock on the black market. Ball points out that in the real world, Black America spends 44% of its income on rent alone.
Yeah.
When you add utilities, transportation, food, clothing, student, and consumer debt, there's next to nothing left to invest.
Yeah.
Patronizing black banks and other businesses simply will not create the mythical black-owned entities that will somehow hire millions of now jobless black workers to manufacture the cars, computers, cell phones, fuel, electricity, clothing, healthcare, and other services and goods made by somebody else, which African Americans now consume. Nobody has ever boycotted and shopped their way to freedom. Lazy demagogues touting this nonsense never explain just how this buying power might somehow be intelligently redirected from utilities, transportation, rent, and whatnot into the coffers of some entity that will, quote unquote, reinvest in black communities because they simply cannot.
Yeah, and Martin Luther King, one of the main things he was pushing is this. He was trying to get this idea of businesses, but he was trying to get it outside of the confines of the Democratic Party. He understood that this was somewhat of a black hole. Yeah, the guy's right. I mean, when you there's this piece that Richard Wolff does. I think he did it several months ago, where he went within a line of how much money people had in the bank and then broke it down by race. And it was appalling. Like 95% of the wealth under Obama went to the top 1%.
Yeah.
And that oh my God, like that number by itself is staggering. And then you have 95% of the jobs that were created were low wage or minimum wage, like low wage jobs. Like, this is not this kind of awesome economy that these guys are pretending that it is.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that the guy is wrong in that particular post. He sounds like he's more right than not, if I had to gauge it. I don't want to gut BLM's what they're trying to do, because I feel like they're trying to do something. Whether it has the outcome that they're desiring, I don't know.
Well,
like that's a tough one. I think the guy's probably more right than not.
I think the critique was that it was an organization that was started around racial justice, and in going towards black capitalism, it sort of strayed kind of far from its original mission. And the other thing with the foundation money, I actually am Facebook friends with Patrisse Cullors, and covered an event that she's very involved with. It's called Justice LA, and they're trying to divert the $3.5 billion that the county wants to spend building new jails to schools and programs for youth and, you know, mental health programs. 'Cause right now, the jails are the biggest warehousers of the mentally ill that we have here in Los Angeles. And it's horrible, really. So I met
liberal LA, no less. I mean, you guys are supposed to be lefties of the country.
No. I mean, yeah, we've got a DA, Jackie Lacey, who refuses to prosecute any officers for, you know, there was one killing a couple of years ago where he was shot in cold blood. He wasn't fighting back. The officer's partner disputed the officer's contention that he was reaching for his gun. The police chief said that he should be fired. He should be prosecuted. The police commission said he should be prosecuted. And after a year, Jackie Lacey refused to press charges. And she had this 88-page opinion that was pure bullshit. And I actually, you know, interviewed Pat Harris about this because he's running for Senate against Dianne Feinstein. And he is a lawyer himself, and a civil rights lawyer and a criminal justice lawyer. And he said she ought to resign because it's absolutely outrageous. And this is, yes, in liberal Los Angeles, where we've had more police killings, I think, than any other city. So, but the point is, she told me that this George Soros money, or the Ford Foundation money, they didn't see any percentage of the $500,000 they were supposed to give. But, you know, my antennas go up when I see that, because I think about, oh, this is how they try to co-opt social movements. Yeah. And it's like there's a whole book called The Revolution Must Not Be Funded, you know? And that's because we who are in social movements need to keep our autonomy, because look at who these foundations are run by and who they were started by. Some of the biggest imperialist, warmongering, capitalist, racists out there. I mean, Henry Ford was a complete racist and an anti-Semite.
But how do you form, I guess, but that's always the dilemma, right? I mean, when you're talking about running a campaign, there's a conversation between Amika Kuntz and I think Gloria Steiner. I think that's the name. And they're having this conversation. They're talking about Democrats. You know, Namika is one of those people who believe they can board the ship and take back the Democratic Party and all this other stuff. And they get to the point of talking about funding. And that's where there's this kind of this silence, because all of them hit their head on this thing of, yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem. Democrats are funded in this way. That's a problem. As if it's like you're talking about taking back the ship. But how are you going to take back the ship when your funding source is based on people who literally hold the strings, who tug the strings in some way? These people may have a certain antenna that are wired a particular way, meaning they're more agreeable to a certain plutocratic bunch. Fair enough. But I think in that conversation, two people who, for the most part, had this idea of the board and ship thing, were true blue Democrats, were still stuck on this idea of these guys have a funding source that somewhat puts hooks in them. And how do we get past this idea that these guys have funding sources that put hooks in them? I don't know what. That's always an issue. Like, I guess I don't. It's like, how do you fund a movement without funding a movement? You know what I mean? It's always that weird dichotomy goes there.
Supposed to be individual contributions. I mean, just like Bernie Sanders was able to fund his campaign with $27 contributions. Originally, PBS was supported by, you know how they always say, viewers like you.
Viewers like you, right.
People now don't have money to support their public television station or their public radio station, so they get it from foundations, they get it from corporations, and that's why we call NPR National Petroleum Radio, because all their stories on fracking are so pro-fracking. You know, they try to be unbiased, but they usually give the pro-fracking side more time. They always give them the last word, so it's the last thing you heard before the story is over. And, you know, then of course they blatantly announce that the Natural Gas Alliance is one of their, is one of their funders. So, you know, when they have to go to corporations and foundations that are funded by corporations, you automatically have to be suspicious of their motives. But that said, I feel like I was attacked merely for posting this article. in two different groups. Sandernista's group, an individual, and I'm not sure if he's white or black, said, what gives you the right to opine about this, first of all, to have an...
What gives you the right?
Yes. And then I posted it in Black Lives Matter, Allies Unite. Okay, so Allies Unite, I'm thinking this is like for white allies.
Yeah.
Post this thing here, and I got to tell you what this guy wrote. I mean, this guy...
wait, just because you put the article, I mean, but there was an African-American that wrote the article. They're saying that you can't even opine on something. You can't even talk about it.
Yes, I've got to find this guy's post because, oh no, now my Facebook is stuck. It's frozen. Well, why don't you talk more about Black Lives Matter while I look for this thing?
So what I would say is, I agree with you. Yes, they would have to be funded. And you can make a case that many of us, I mean, myself included, gets funded by this now. So I guess you can say there's a positive thing because people get more accustomed to funding the things that they themselves support. It's like people who like my channel help support the channel. I would imagine the same thing for your channel and other channels around. So the YouTube stuff.
I don't know. I don't.
Oh, you don't do it?
No, I don't get money.
But the core of this, though, is the fiscal incentive. I mean, that's what we're talking about. The moment that you pay somebody, you somewhat to pull the strings on the person that you pay. But that's built into our system at the very core of the system itself, whether you're talking about politics or workers. Like when you go into a job, you're essentially beholden to your boss. Your boss says, go and do this random stupid thing. You go this random stupid thing and money is made and you get a little pinch of it and he gets the most. Your boss says you need to wear a particular thing. You need to talk a particular way. You need to do a particular thing. You don't necessarily care about the social impact because you care more about being able to feed your kids and family. I asked my mom this. My mom is the nicest person on the planet. And I said, if you were a used car salesman and you needed to sell a lemon in order to feed your wife and kids, would you do so? And my mom is like, oh, you know, I wouldn't do this and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, you're letting your kid go hungry? Is that what you're telling me you'll do? In which case she's grudgingly said, yes, of course. If I would needed to sell that lemon, I would sell that lemon. I would feel bad about myself, but I'll sell that lemon because I need to feed my wife and kids. But that's all of us. Like to varying degrees, all of us in that very specific situation, meaning that this is somewhat of an issue with human beings being in this particular capitalistic system that compels a particular behavior within those people that oftentimes is not necessarily the best thing in the world.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I found the post, and what I want to get back to is this political correctness. Like, who's allowed to talk about this stuff? Like, how many times have I been told I need to take a back seat, or that I'm white-splaining, or that somebody says something to me, I'm expressing white fragility. So, you know, I post this article. I don't even post a comment because I just post the article, and this guy writes, why are you even a member of this group? You are clearly no ally to this movement. Don't try to disguise your anti-blackness as genuine outrage.
Wow, that's
personally, I think this is an interesting article, and I even agree with some points. But if black folks want to have this discussion, it's up to us, not you.
Wow.
Completely overstepping your boundaries in what is supposed to be a safe space for black people.
That's amazing.
Right?
Look, all perspectives are relative to one another. So you will find some perspectives that are floating in a void that looks at anything that talks about it in a particular way. Meaning you have to take in for the moment his context. Like his context is, this is a black conversation, see your way out. Now, from your context, this is a lefty conversation, and I'm commenting on this from the standpoint of a lefty. Well, he doesn't quite understand that you're commenting on this from the perspective of a lefty, not the perspective of somebody who's black. It gets a little weird in having these conversations because look, if somebody errs on the side of being a little bit sensitive because of their historical thing, fair enough. I give leeway. I look at this from the standpoint of a lefty. I understand from the context of someone of the African American, but it's nonsense to believe that people are not going to comment on the article that's written for everybody to comment on. It's like, come on. So I look at this from the standpoint of somebody who's somewhat of a lefty and think class is more important. If Black Lives Matter, think of it like this. Think of it from the standpoint of if you had a group, that group was created. That group was created on this idea of racial justice and everything else. That group associates itself with one of the political parties. And associating itself with one of the political parties, it somehow gets disconnected from the thing that it first started doing in the first place. And other African Americans said, wait a minute, this looks a little weird. This looks a little strange. Are these guys doing what they say they were doing in the first place? You have other people who are on the left, who are not necessarily Black, who say, wait a minute, this looks a little weird. Is this group doing what this group says they're going to do? And then somebody says, how dare you, sir, comment on the fact that this group may not be doing what they say. That's nonsense.
Well, it also has to do with political correctness. I think some people on the left are so
Screw that. I don't care about the political
marginalized people that they think you can't critique anything, even if you're an ally. And I had to literally go into my YouTube videos and show the video that I made for Occupy the LAPD on January 1st, 2015, after I got my group Occupy Venice to project Black Lives Matter on the side of City Hall. Absolutely ridiculous for this guy to say that I'm not an ally of this movement when I'm covering so much of their stuff. But that's not the point. The point is that I'm seeing, the other term they use is tone policing, okay? Like, you have to watch your tone. Like, if somebody gets really outrageous and I say, take it down a notch, you're getting too angry. Okay, then I'm calling them the angry black
person. Yeah.
And I'm tone policing them. It's like, I don't even get in these conversations anymore because this always fucking happens, Jamarl. I know that my intentions are good. And I'm just trying to for me, I am not into censorship. It's like, I don't buy that. I think Milo Xenopoulos, whatever his name is, should be allowed to speak at Berkeley.
Agreed.
I mean, I supported the Nazis' right to march in Skokie. I was in college then in 1978, and I was working at WBZ in Boston. I was doing an internship at the news department that summer, and I remember covering those marches, and everybody was so worried because there were so many Holocaust survivors living in the town of Skokie that it was just going to be so triggering, Yeah. And I, was in college at the time and studying about the First Amendment. And I just said, look, the reason we have a free speech in this country is because all speech needs to be out there. And the way to counter bad speech is to have good speech. So what should happen is the B'nai B'rith, or the Anti-Defamation League of, the Jewish Federation should have a counter protest. Similarly, when Milo speaks at Berkeley, they always have a counter protest. Now, there's some violence and Antifa and the whole thing, but the fact is, I don't think that speech should be suppressed. The group that I organized fighting education privatization with, the Badass Teachers Association, they suppressed the World Socialist website, which I've been getting a lot of information about. And I think they've been doing stellar reporting on the teacher strikes, but they have a critique, and that their critique is that the union leaders, this teachers union leaders, are trying to settle these strikes prematurely. They're not listening to the rank and file who want to be more radical. And so this is the critique that the World Socialist website has, and this group, the Badass Teachers Association that I organized with, they banned them from posting in their Facebook page.
Wow.
Yes, because they said, A, they're anti-teacher union, and B, they're racist because they posted this article about Black Lives Matter, Isn't that insane?
Wow.
I mean, is it just me, or is everybody going, we got the thought police out there. Forget about the tone police. We've got the thought police.
So there is a faction of the left that tends to be more on the SJW side. Now, I've always kind of made the point that the level of SJW is...
What is that? What is that?
Social justice warriors. It's like tone police. Like you're saying, this thing of you can't say this, you shouldn't say this. Calling this person hysterical is somehow horrible and anti-woman, or telling this person, posting this video is somehow racist. Like it's like, I give you a perfect example. We were at an anti-war conference, and someone in the line screamed, "Women and blacks, get in the front of the line!" And all of the women and blacks in the line was like, "What the hell are you talking about? Shut up!" Like it's there is a faction of the left that has this thing that don't like people saying certain things. Now, here's the thing. All of these things go in gradients. Like, if you were living in the 50s and you were calling, somebody an N-word, then at that time there was the social justice warriors person who say, hey, you probably shouldn't say that. That's somewhat of a bad thing. But at the point where the scales move and you get to the point where that language becomes like Milo and saying, okay, we need to shut him up. He shouldn't be able to say whatever he wants to say. You've gone too far. Let Milo say what he says, because the moment that you shut him up, they're going to start shutting up other speech. Just like when they start shutting up, they got rid of some of the right wingers that were on medium.com. And then someone on Mother Jones says, hey, let's also get rid of some of these left wingers like Caitlin Johnston.
Yeah.
Like, think about that. Like they're not content with where they are. They also want to push back at some of these other things that they don't necessarily agree with. Yeah, I think it's a big deal.
And you had a show about that. I think it was yesterday.
Free speech is precisely for the speech you don't like. Yeah.
I mean, they had the CNN Money investigative report in which they included Jimmy Dore with Alex Jones and neo-Nazis and pedophiles and everything, just because he challenges the mainstream media.
It's amazing.
The corporate narrative, right?
They slander them completely. They call them a conspiracy theory. I mean, they literally like it's one thing if you give a narrative, you say this is what we believe takes place. CNN. That is not the word of God. That's CNN's perspective. That's their narrative of events. This is what CNN believes to be the hypothesis of the case. You have other people who say, well, dude, you haven't really done anything. Your hypothesis of the case is extraordinarily jaded for. And here's the other perspective challenging your narrative of events. Everything that we're challenging with comes from like New York Times and these other mainstream news sources. Now, CNN looks at this and says, this guy's just a conspiracy theory. Why? He's challenging your narrative of events using your real information. Like if Mattis comes out and Mattis says, well, we don't know that the Syrian government did it. Is Mattis also a conspiracy theorist? Now that Mattis is saying we have no idea who did it. Like when Tulsi Gabbard gets these guys to say this is illegal, CNN never uses that term legality. Like when the New York Times comes out, I read multiple articles on the day that Trump did those bombings. None of those articles had the word legal in it. And exactly what took place was completely illegal. When they was doing the bombings, nobody brings up legality. Like people like Dore brings up stuff that CNN completely ignores. CNN has a very specific perspective of events that is usually pro-war. And so they don't necessarily call out the war. They don't necessarily call out the fact that we're paying terrorists. They leave all that stuff off the table. So imagining the situation of somebody who's watching CNN and binges CNN, completely missing the stuff on Yemen, completely missing the stuff on Saudi Arabia, completely missing the stuff on the things that we're doing in Syria. And they come to the conclusion, well, I mean, they fired those chemical weapons. I mean, it's a flat fact that they did so. No, that's not really true. It's a flat fact that they did. So surely we need to do something. Well, that's kind of my point. It's a jaded perspective of events. So they attack Dore. Yeah. Just as a conspiracy theorist. And like you said, putting him in with neo-Nazis, with Alex Jones, and acting as if there's some kind of equivalency between these neo-Nazis and Jimmy Dore. It's amazing.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of our time. In fact, we've gone over. I had wanted to limit us to an hour because there's only so much I think people have an attention span for.
Fair enough.
Let's just close by talking about what are you working on? What are going to be some of your shows this week? Have you thought about it?
I have what is that gentleman's name? Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl Thomas is coming on to my show on the 24th. He is an African Americans professor. Speaking of African Americans, the man is amazing. I didn't know who he was until somebody kind of pointed him out, and I looked him up and immediately sent him an email asking him to come on his show. I became aware of some of the stuff he was saying about African Americans and the reason for the American Revolution, in addition to the Civil War. Did you know Abraham Lincoln was trying to get rid of Africans at the time? Like they called the man the Great Emancipator. He was literally trying to kick us out the country. He didn't necessarily want us in the country. And we were only a few votes short of being kicked out the country. Another thing that Horn kind of made this point, and I'll leave it on this. The reasoning for the Civil War. If you look at the Civil War for the most part, American Revolution in the context of South Africa, like that, South Africa right now is having this conversation on whether or not they're going to strip white farmers from colonialization. Essentially, white farmers have like 70, 80% of the land or something, some ridiculous amount. And they're making the case, look, you guys were able to benefit magnificently from colonialization. It is time to give that land up, and we're taking this land. Now, and you look at the reasons for the way South Africa broke down, meaning the reason why South Africa became the way it is, this kind of little colony unto itself. breaking away from Britain and everything else. And then look at America and look at how we broke away from Britain and the reasons we broke away from Britain. It gets fascinating. It gets absolutely, I love history. I get a wow out of history.
Yeah, I was a teenager myself.
It's fascinating because you get into this thing of South Africa wanted to maintain a certain dominance in the same way that America wanted to maintain a certain dominance, certain wealthy owners. And Britain was going to get rid of slavery. And you had this thing of them putting a line in the sand where Britain didn't want to go beyond a certain point in America, whether America wanted to actually go further, meaning the government here. It's fascinating. The guy's going to be awesome. So he's coming on the show on Wednesday, I believe.
Okay. Well, tomorrow, guys, I'm going to be having Jimmy Dore back in my house again. And hopefully I'll get him to sit for another interview, because my conversation with Jimmy Dore was my most watched video ever. It got 62,000 views. And the camera was so shaky because I had, this is like unbelievable. And I didn't even realize before I edited this in iMovie that I could have zoomed in the editing process. But it was terrible video because the cameraman was just not watching the shot was widely framed. People were walking in and out of the shot. At one point, he took the camera off the tripod. You could see the tripod in the shot. But 62,000 people still watched it, and I think they really enjoyed the content. So Jimmy Dore is coming for a fundraiser tomorrow for Gail McLaughlin. And Gail is running for lieutenant governor here in California. I wish she were running for governor because she's fantastic. But she's running as no party preference. And we're doing a fundraiser because she is she's one of the corporate-free candidates. And she is known for, when she was the Green Party mayor of Richmond, beating back Chevron and getting her entire slate from the Richmond Progressive Alliance elected to the majority of the board of the city council there in Richmond, even though the Chevron candidates outspent them 20-1. And they did that through good old-fashioned organizing, and they cleaned up a lot of things there. They cleaned up housing. They cleaned up some police practices. And it's just a wonderful city now. And Gail even threatened after the foreclosure crisis, if the banks would not reduce the principal payments so that the people who lived in there could stay in their homes, she would seize their homes by eminent domain. And it was really amazing, ballsy move that she did. So I'm going to interview her. I'm going to interview Jimmy. Maybe I'm going to interview them both. But anyway, that's going to be tomorrow night. Pretty late for you people on the East Coast, because it's going to be around 8 o'clock Pacific time. So that's like 11 o'clock East Coast time. And after that, I'm working on a show on factory farming in America and how almost all we had 55,000 small family farms in this country in 1915. And now we have about an equal number of factory farms that are employing industrial techniques that are harmful to the animals, to the environment, and to human health. And now the Chinese are buying up all of those factory farms. So China is owning a lot more of this country than just, luxury real estate businesses. They're buying farms, and what are the implications of that? So anyway, I want to close the show by thanking Jamarl. And I always love talking to you, whether it's on the air or off the air, because I think you're really smart and interesting. And obviously, we share a lot of the same perspectives on things. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing me on. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good week, everyone, and keep fighting.